woman. Matter of fact, at the time of her death, a person who was not a member of the church wrote in the obituary, the Mountain View Register Leader. This is July 23rd, 1915, in Mountain View, California. Mrs. White's most enduring monument, aside from her godly life and conversation means your behavior, was her published works, which tend to be the purest morality, lead to Christ and to the Bible. Now, this person standing on the outside looking in, what was their conclusion? Her writings did not say, look at me. It said, look at Christ, look at the Bible, and godly life. And they bring comfort and consolation to many weary hearts. She has done what she could, and now, being dead, yet speaketh through her writings. Now, having said that, I think it's a good idea for me to pause right here and remind everybody that prophets are also people. I've discovered that some people think that prophets, once a person is called and given the gift of prophecy, they sort of hover everywhere they go, and they emit this glowing light, and they got a halo, and everything they say is a prophecy. You realize, of course, that like when a prophet sits down at dinner with other people and they say, please pass the salt, you don't write that down and say, I wonder what the spiritual meaning of that is. But there are people out there, and there are folks that are sincere, but they just don't use clear thinking, and they forget that prophets are people. For instance, in the Bible, Miriam, she's called a prophetess. Isn't that right? Sister of Moses, was a prophetess. Very clear in the Bible. But did she make mistakes? Yeah. At one time, she even had to be chastised by the Lord. He struck her with leprosy and then healed her later because she was giving her brother a hard time. I've got actually a list here in the Bible. Nathan the prophet. Prophets were not all-knowing. They only knew what God showed them when He showed it. These are holy men and women that were moved by the Holy Spirit. God spoke through them, but they were still people like you and me in that respect. Their lives were consistent, they were godly, but they were not perfect. Do you understand the difference? There's only one human who's lived a perfect life. Who is that? That's Jesus. What does that imply? Everybody else had the frailties and they made mistakes. Nathan the prophet, for instance, one time, and by the way, this is in 1 Chronicles 17, verse 2 to 4. David is in his house. He's praying. David does not feel good because the ark is in a tent. The tent is already hundreds of years old. And David is thinking, I'm living in a house made of cedar. We should make a temple for the Lord. So Nathan the prophet's visiting David, and David says, I want to build a place for God. And Nathan says, sounds like a good idea. Go for it. Lord's with you, David. As Nathan is walking out, the word of the Lord came to Nathan and said, Nathan, go back and talk to David. You spoke too soon. That is not my plan. David is not to build the temple because he is a bloody man. He's guilty of shedding blood of innocent people. His son will build the house for me. And so the first time Nathan spoke, he was speaking like you and I would speak, sharing his opinion, say, God's been with you. It must be something God's leading you to do. Do it. God said, no, not David. He can get all the material, but Solomon's to build it. But don't miss that point. Nathan was a human, and he thought like normal people and used his judgment. Samuel the prophet. When God said, Samuel, stop crying about Saul, Samuel said, oh, Lord, can't you do something to straighten Saul out? I sure wish. He's so big and tall and handsome. And God said, he's hopeless. He's grieved me away. Stop crying about him. Go pick someone from the sons of Jesse. So Samuel goes to meet with Jesse. He says, gather your sons. Samuel looks at the tallest. He's trying to find a replacement for Saul, who was a head and shoulders taller than everybody else. He looks at Eliab, I think it was. He says, this must be the one. And God said, no, stop looking on the outside. Samuel was human. He thought, he looks like a king to me. This must be the one. God said, no, Samuel. So prophets had opinions. Their opinions were not always right. You listening? Some people have taken some of these facts and it's got them all twisted up. Paul was a prophet. How many agree? 1 Corinthians 7, verse 6. Paul says, but I speak this by permission and not by commandment. What did he mean by that? Well, he said, some things I'm sharing with you from the wisdom that God has given me, just through experience, by permission. I don't have any word from God about this. And so he had the foresight to say, you may be reading my writings letter. Know that I'm saying this by permission and not by commandment. So that's one example of this. 1 Corinthians 7:25, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment. Can you understand what Paul's saying here? 2 Corinthians 11:17, that which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly. Paul said, look, let me speak like a fool for a minute. And so, just trying to give you perspective. You know, one time Paul had to chastise Peter. Because even after Peter was converted and he's out preaching, he's been filled with the Holy Spirit, after Pentecost, Paul had to pull Peter aside and say, Peter, you know, you're being a little hypocritical. Because when the Jews aren't around, you're just hanging out with the Gentiles. But when the Jews come from Jerusalem, you're acting like you don't know the Gentiles. You're being two-faced. Have you read Galatians where Paul does that? Was Peter a prophet? Yeah, but they were people. And Ellen White was human too. But her life was every bit as godly and consistent as these lives that you see here. Elijah the prophet. Was he a prophet? I mean, you know, hey, if you get a heavenly escort to heaven before you die, you're doing something right. And yet Elijah got discouraged. It's interesting to me that Peter was ready to die for Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when the mob came to arrest him. When he was surrounded by his friends, he pulled out a sword. He was ready to fight these men. He wasn't afraid. A little later, a girl started to make fun of him, and he buckled. Elijah stood up to 850 prophets of Baal and prophets of the grove. Later, Jezebel sends him a message, and he runs for the wilderness. Men are intimidated by women, aren't they? And when Elijah gets out there in the wilderness, he prays that he might die. Well, do prophets get discouraged? Are they people? I mean, do prophets always do exactly what they're told? What about Jonah? How many agree Jonah was a prophet? Bible calls him a prophet. God says to Jonah, Jonah, I got a message for you to deliver. I want you to go east. He goes west. Did he stop being a prophet when he went the wrong way, or did God just get his attention and send him back the right way? Sometimes prophets are reluctant to give their messages. When Ellen White was first called, she said, oh, Lord, please, I'm shy. I can't do this. And then she realized how it grieved Jesus, and she loved Jesus so much. And she said, I can't bear to think of the frown of Jesus upon me. And so she said, Lord, if you promise to be with me and give me the strength, I'll do what you're asking me to do. But she was extremely reluctant to be in this position of visibility. Very humble, shy person naturally, and it always took the power of God to give her the strength to get up in front of anybody and to write some of the difficult things that she had to write. Something else I've noticed as I read through the Bible is that generally prophets are not accepted in their own day. It takes a while for it to settle in. When Paul first was converted and he started to preach, the church ran from him. They said, we know what you're up to. And finally, Barnabas took him in, and gradually it took a period of time of proving himself before they started to accept him. Finally, Peter had to write a letter and say, even our beloved brother Paul, as he's written to you in his letter, Peter kind of gave him an endorsement. Because up till then, when he was first called, they said, he's two-faced. He was killing Christians, now he's preaching, he's a hypocrite. They said, it's political. Or maybe he got fired by the Sanhedrin, he's just looking for another job. I mean, folks are like that, you know. When Jesus first came, there was a lot of criticism. Then his writings and his truth and the evidence began to spread across the world. So I just wanted to spend a moment or two talking about that. Another misconception I'd like to spend a moment on is some people have thought that Ellen White was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. How many of you have heard that before? No, Ellen White was really one of many founders. It was a group of people. Matter of fact, in some senses, you could probably argue that a sea captain by the name of Joseph Bates may have been more of a founder. He's the one that brought the Sabbath truth to Ellen White. And just a very godly man. I'll tell you what, if you want to read an exciting autobiography, read the autobiography of Joseph Bates. Starts out as a cabin boy and has the most harrowing adventures and in prison and in war, and just quite an adventure. And you ever eat lima beans? How many of you don't like lima beans? Do you know where lima beans come from? A sea captain named Joseph Bates picked them up in Lima, Peru, and brought them up to South America and introduced them to North America. So you can blame Adventists for lima beans and cornflakes. So, number 10. Are miracles definite evidence